Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me here. It's very exciting to be part of this project. What I want to speak about today is the question of alternatives to Zionism, but I look at the issue from an historical perspective. That is to say, I'm not talking about current alternatives, but historical alternatives, especially in the first half of the 20th century. But I also want to talk about the lessons of specific movements that were challenging Zionism in that period. And maybe in the discussion after the talk, we could raise the issues of the relevance of this historical analysis to contemporary movements and what kind of practical implications this discussion might have for those who want to organize today in the present rather than just learn about historical issues. So let's start with the late 19th century, which is a long time ago, but that's basically the starting point for the discussion. Why? Because that's when the Zionist movement was created. And since its beginnings, the Zionist project has always faced criticism from within its own ranks, as well as from outsiders. Alongside the resistance of local Arabs or Palestinians, it's also experienced opposition from Jewish constituencies. And three critical trends were particularly important: the religious Orthodox rejection of secular nationalism, left-wing opposition, which elevated universal socialist principles above nationalist goals, and liberal humanist critique of the quest for a Jewish state in Palestine and its associated exclusionary practices. In this presentation, I will focus on the two dimensions. I will not talk about religion, but I will talk about leftist and liberal humanist critiques of Zionism, and both of them focus on the question of relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Many things have changed since those early days, but some of these issues are still relevant for us today, and I'll try to highlight some of them in the course of the presentation. Liberal critics of Zionism in the late 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, adhered to a version of Zionism which supported the formation of a Jewish spiritual center rather than a political entity in Palestine. Many of them defined themselves as Zionists, but a different kind of Zionists who supported Jewish immigration to the country and settlement, but they distanced themselves from the Zionist, mainstream Zionist quest for a state where Jews would dominate demographically and politically. These voices, these critical voices, have a long history, but they became consolidated organizationally with the formation of one movement that I'll speak about in greater detail, which is known as the Brit Shalom Association, which was formed in 1925 in mandatory Palestine. And they were the first to develop a more coherent perspective as an organization rather than a group of individuals. And the association defined its objectives, I'm quoting, as to arrive at an understanding between Jews and Arabs as to the form of their mutual social relations in Palestine, on the basis of absolute political equality of two culturally autonomous peoples, and to determine the lines of their cooperation for the development of the country. Brit Shalom was a consolidated organization, but it contained many different personalities and perspectives within it, and sometimes they clash sharply with one another. Between 1925 and 1933, and was known primarily for its advocacy of binationalism. In fact, they may have coined the term binationalism in that particular context, which we still use today as one of the options or political visions that guide critical voices in relation to Israel-Palestine. but it experienced tension between its broad liberal principles and the narrow demands of the Zionist project. These were captured in particular in the work of its founder and the best known member of the group at the time, Arthur Rupin, who is also known as the father of Jewish settlement. Rupin was torn between his labor Zionist allies, who regarded Brit Shalom as delusional, and his radical colleagues within the organization who called for a representative government in Palestine in line with universal democratic values, but against the wishes of the Zionist leadership. We must remember at the time, the notion of representative government representing the population of Palestine was vigorously opposed by the Zionist leadership because Jews were a minority. So a representative government in Palestine meant a government voted and representing the majority of the Arab population at the time. And of course, Zionists opposed that demand, and quite successfully, I must say. Rupin expressed growing concerns about what he called the very serious contradictions of interest between the Jews and the Arabs. It was impossible, he argued, to reconcile, on the one hand, free immigration and free economic and cultural development for Jews, which were the essential conditions for Zionist development, with the interests of the Arab residents of Palestine. And he said, in any place where we buy land and settle people on it, of necessity, this requires that the current cultivators, the peasants who were working there and living there, be removed from it, be they owners or tenants. Therefore, it became impossible to convince the Arabs rationally that our interests are compatible. One question that I'll just pose now, but it's something to reflect later on, is why did Rupin consider it essential that any land bought by Jewish settlement agencies must remove the non-Jews, the Arabs, the Palestinians who were living on that land? Why did he take for granted that this was an essential condition for Jewish settlement? Why couldn't they share the land? Of course, for him, it was taken for granted that that was the case. But in historical terms, we do need to ask the question, why was that chosen as the dominant pattern of Zionist settlement? Rupin's dilemma intensified at times of acute conflict following the violent clashes of 1929, which seemed to pit two mutually exclusive nationalist visions against each other. And his conclusion, following the uprising and repression that followed it, British repression of the Arab or Palestinian uprising, his conclusion was stark. We must recognize, he said, that in our entire history of relations with the Arabs, we have not made an effort to find a formula that will satisfy not only the essential interests of the Jews, but also the essential interests of the Arab. Paradoxically, he said, this means, and that's a very famous quotation from his work, what we can get from the Arabs, we do not need. And what we do need, we cannot get. At most, what the Arabs are willing to give us is rights of a Jewish national minority in an Arab state, similar to the rights of minority nationalities in Eastern Europe. Why was that a problem? For him, it was a problem because minority rights could not be guaranteed. The fate of the Jewish minority in Palestine will forever depend on the goodwill of the Arab majority holding power. As Zionism, willing to reach such a compromise with the Arabs, that is to say, willing to acknowledge Jews as a minority in the country, will lose the support of Jews in Eastern Europe and will quickly become Zionism without Zionists. What could be done then under such circumstances? Rupin says, when time comes and the Arabs realize that they are not called upon to grant us something we do not have already, but to recognize reality as it is, the weight of facts on the ground will lead to reduced tension. It may be a bitter truth, but it is the truth. The notion of facts of the ground as the only way of advancing Zionist, Jewish, Israeli interests is, of course, very important throughout the history of Zionist settlement. And the way Rupin was using it, that goes back to the 1930s, is indicative of a transition from attempts to find some kind of accommodation based on mutual compromises and concessions into asserting exclusively the right of Jewish Zionist interest against all resistance, using force in order to entrench Jewish settlement and political rights in the country. But not all liberal activists moved in the same direction. There was an opposite example at the same time from within the same organization by one of the prominent intellectuals in Cohen, who became a very well-known academic in the US in subsequent years, but at the time he was living in Palestine. And he broke off with the Zionist movement and left Brit Shalom following the 1929 uprising. Why did he do that? It's interesting to look at his argument. He identified with Zionism as a moral or spiritual movement that was compatible with principles of pacifism and anti-imperialism for him. But it became increasingly difficult for him to sustain this approach alongside the official Zionist line. The uprising of 1929, he said in private, it wasn't an argument he presented openly, was carried out by Arabs who perpetrated all the barbaric acts that are characteristic of a colonial revolt. But they were motivated by a deep cause. And Cohen's punchline is, we have been in Palestine for 12 years, meaning since the Balfour Declaration of 1917, without having even once made a serious attempt at seeking through negotiations the consent of the indigenous people. We have been relying exclusively upon Great Britain's military might. This attitude meant for him that for 12 years, I'm quoting here, we pretended that the Arabs did not exist and were glad when we were not reminded of their existence. But without the consent of local Arabs, Jewish existence in Palestine could become possible only first with British aid and then later with the help of our own bayonets. Cohen's main concern was the development of Zionism into what he called the militant reactionary wing of Judaism. His colleagues, Cohen felt, were unwilling to take a decisive step in line with their values that would lead them away from Zionist practices, such as the immeasurable barbarity, that's his phrase, of evicting tenants from the land, led by people such as Rupin. Rupin and Cohen offered opposite solutions to the same dilemma, the difficulty, perhaps impossibility, of reconciling universal humanism with Zionist nationalism. When crisis erupted, Rupin chose nationalism, while Cohen chose universalism. Other activists continued to believe there was no contradiction between the two sets of principles, but their impact diminished over time. It's, if you want to look at a contemporary example, it's like the debate over the compatibility of Jewish and democratic state. Can you have a democratic state that is also Jewish? Do you need to choose between the Jewish nature of the state or the democratic nature of the state? The debate between Cohen and Rupin is an early version, almost a century ago, of the same debate that we are continuing to conduct today. The notion that Jewish immigration and land settlement must not be disrupted was central to the binationalists, but they also insisted that these activities must not be carried out that's the liberal humanist aspect of their Zionism, must not be carried out at the expense of Arabs or lead to their dispossession. For example, when land was bought by Jewish agencies, some of it must be allocated to the tenants, or they could be employed on part of it. Opposition to the principles of sole ownership and 100% Hebrew or Jewish labor in Jewish-owned enterprises set Brit Shalom apart from all the other Zionist forces. Now, in the terms of the time, this may not be seen as a, that was seen as a critique of Zionism from within, but it was not regarded as being anti-Zionist. But perhaps today, this notion that you must share the land and you must share political power is regarded as anti-Zionist, or would be regarded as anti-Zionist, because of the focus on exclusive Jewish political sovereignty. The key concept for Brit Shalom was political parity. The idea that Jews and Arabs should share state power equally, regardless of their proportion in the population. In matters of culture, religion, and education, each national community would be autonomous and free to pursue its own course. Other matters such as roads, industry, trade, and so on may be just handled in common because you don't have a specific national focus. But issues of land, immigration, and job would be negotiated because they involve relationship between the communities. Neither a Jewish state nor simple majority rule could guarantee this type of relationship. Only a binational state and entrenched inequality between groups and individuals would guarantee a viable solution. Brit Shalom collapsed around 1933. It ceased to operate, partly as a result of a sense of urgency around the rise of Nazism in Germany, accelerated immigration into Palestine, accelerated political mobilization within the Arab-Palestinian community, maybe just exhaustion of individual activists. But another organization came into being a decade later in the 1940s by the name of Ihud, which means union or unity, led by two prominent individuals, Yehuda Magnus, who was the chancellor of the Hebrew University, and the philosopher Martin Buber, who had lived in Germany but had immigrated to Palestine in the late 1930s. And he declared its support for a union between the Jewish and Arab peoples as essential for the upbuilding of Palestine and for cooperation between the Jewish world and the Arab world in all branches of life. In order to realize that, government in Palestine must be based, I'm quoting for the founding declaration, upon equal political rights for the two peoples, a federal union between Palestine and neighboring countries in order to guarantee the national rights of all the people within it. A direct response to the positions of Ihud was given by Arab-British academic Albert Hourani, who was speaking for the Arab office, which was like a Palestinian sort of public political relations office, in a testimony to the 1946 Anglo-American Committee. Hourani opposed the binational state because he argued it could work only if a certain spirit of cooperation and trust exists, but that kind of cooperation and trust, the sense of it, did not exist. If it had existed, you wouldn't need to have these prolonged negotiations and conflict. But even if it were possible, Hourani argues, a binational state would lead either to a complete deadlock or to the domination of the whole life of the state by communal consideration, meaning permanent conflict. In conclusion of this section on binationalism, liberal humanist critique of Zionism, I'm skipping a lot of boring historical detail. Although they formulated a solid conceptual alternative to mainstream state-oriented Zionism, the binationalist activists failed to reach out beyond limited Jewish intellectual circles and did not gain any Arab support. Why? Before 1948, liberal Zionists worked among the one segment of the Jewish people that was least willing to support integration. There were many Jews who were happy to live together with non-Jews as equals, or were not interested in political sovereignty. But these Jews stayed in their home countries or moved to other destinations that allowed them to live long and prosper, without worrying about politics and nationalism, such as the USA or South Africa or Argentina. On practical ground, the liberal Zionist case in Palestine was undermined further by the absence of a similar force among the Arab population. And many Jews regarded it as offering unilateral concessions that were not reciprocated and thus were pointless. Why were they not reciprocated? Because the Palestinian Arab leadership feared that any concession to the legitimacy of Jewish political presence in the country would undermine its own negotiating position without curbing the forward expansion of the Jewish settlement project. This was the case since the liberals were a minority in the Jewish community. Arab political leaders could reach agreement with them, but these agreements would not be binding on Ben-Gurion, on Jabotinsky, on the prominent political leaders of the community, and therefore, from their perspective, they were pointless. What we need to consider in retrospect, this is more of an analytical point, is the responses of one side shaped those responses of the other. Nationalists could embark on their own course of action unilaterally, but liberals could not. Potential Arab partners responded not only to what liberal Zionists said or did, but also, perhaps primarily, to what the leading forces on the Jewish side said and did. And this reinforced the liberals' disadvantage. The dominant trend in both nationalist camps collaborated, so to speak, in making the environment increasingly polarized. What about the left critique? Like the liberal humanist trend, the left-wing critique failed to gain much political allegiance from the Jewish and Arab masses. And I'll focus here on the Palestinian Communist Party as the main force in the left camp overall. Of course, there is also the Zionist left, but by definition, the Zionist left was not a critical force challenging Zionism. It was, in fact, the main force upholding and implementing Zionism. In its early days, the Communist Party, which was formed in 1919, tried to reconcile its attachment to its roots in the Zionist labor movement. It emerged out of the Zionist labor movement with its wish to join the international communist movement that were organized in the Communist International, the Comintern, based in Moscow, which was formed also in 1919. Initially operating under the name Socialist Workers' Party, MPS or MOPS in Hebrew, it adhered to global revolutionary principles, and it saw itself as part of a vanguard of Jewish socialists with an overall mission not restricted to Palestine. But settlement in Palestine remained the crucial principle for it, even though it recognized that there was a Jewish working class, Jewish proletariat in other places, and it will remain so, primarily in Eastern Europe and eventually in the United States as well. But adherence to Zionism in any form was not acceptable to the Communist International, which saw it as a movement aligned with British imperialism. The Communist International, the Comintern, insisted that the party break decisively with Zionism and support an anti-colonial strategy that is centered on alliance with Arab progressive nationalist forces. But at the same time, some contradictions and tensions here, the Comintern also wanted to make inroads into labor Zionism's basis of support among immigrant Jewish workers in Palestine who became disillusioned with the realities there. We are talking about the 1920s now. The key task facing the party in the 1920s was the need to redirect its educational efforts and recruitment drive towards the Arab majority of the population without neglecting and alienating its Jewish constituency. And the one consistent theme throughout the decade was that of setting root among the indigenous workers and peasants and participating in the national movement against British rule and the Zionist political project. But the party's work among Arabs, among local Palestinians, was difficult because of low levels of literacy in that population, low levels of class organization and consciousness in the country, lack of familiarity of party members with local culture and languages, and above all, by the foreign origins of its members. In the vast majority, they owed their presence in the country to Zionism, even if they had renounced much of its principles after having arrived in the country. The Arab national movement regarded ongoing Jewish immigration and the demographic change in the country as the main threat to its quest for independence. And that put leftist activists in a critical dilemma. If they opposed immigration and settlement, they would have undermined the position of its own Jewish members and their own position and their own existence because they were immigrant settlers. On the other hand, to accept immigration and settlement as Jewish national right would have alienated them from the Arab constituency that they tried to recruit. How did they solve or attempt to solve this dilemma? They created, invented, and it's a very interesting innovation, an approach that became known as Yishuvism, from the word Yishuv, which is the Jewish community in Palestine. What was Yishuvism as a theory or perspective? It was a perspective that rejected Zionism as a nationalist ideology and political movement that called for massive Jewish immigration into the country and the creation of a Jewish state there. But at the same time, it accepted the Yishuv, it accepted the Jewish community as legitimate, a legitimate community which would continue to grow and develop due to ongoing immigration, independently of the Zionist project. In the same way, the Jewish communities in the USA, Argentina, South Africa, Britain, continue to grow as a result of immigration, not because of any kind of nationalist ideology. So they wanted to look at Jewish immigration to the country in the context of the overall movement of Jews all over the world, moving away from Eastern Europe, finding greener pastures in many different countries, including Palestine. The practical implication was a combination of two components. First, participation in all Yishuv activities, elections, municipal councils, cultural events, union membership, cooperative life. But at the same time, campaigning against the exclusionary aspects of Zionist policies as expressed in the notions of conquest of labor and conquest of land. So in a sense, they wanted to be part of the community, but to be a radical element that pushes people within it away from Zionism. But the only way they thought that would become possible was by becoming integrated into the community, but as a critical force without it. This strategy was pursued throughout the 1920s, but it came into increasing clash with the international communist movement, with its emphasis on the struggle against colonialism, British colonialism, and the Zionist movement as a colonial movement in association with British imperialism. Even though the activists regarded themselves as performing anti-imperialist tasks, in the eyes of the Palestinian national movement, they were not different from all the other Jews. They were also settlers, they were also recent immigrants, they were also trying to take over the land. regardless of their ideological principles and theoretical positions. So these kind of fine distinctions that were made by this political strategy were kind of lost on the Palestinian national movement. And as a result, the Communist International put increasing pressure on the party to change its orientation and to move decisively away from any trace of Zionism towards focusing on the Arab majority, not just as a mass of people who will carry out the revolution, but as potential members and activists and leaders of the party. And this campaign became known as Arabization. Just in parentheses, I would say that this Arabization is a process that is discussed a lot by historians who talk about political movements, communist, leftist activists in Palestine, but it was part of a universal approach by the Comintern. It was also pursued in other white settler colonial countries like Algeria and South Africa exactly at the same time. So it had local justification, but it was a part of an overall strategy. I don't have much time, so let me just say in sort of to cut a long story short, that the focus on transforming the composition, the membership, the leadership of the party from predominantly Jewish to predominantly Arab to reflect the demographic composition of the country led to increasing tensions within the party. A lot of activists left it altogether. Many returned to Eastern Europe. Many moved to the Soviet Union. Most of them were eventually arrested, deported. Many were executed as well. Most of the original leadership were executed in the Stalinist purges of the late 1930s, early 1940s. But the process also led, these debates about Arabization led to very interesting theoretical debate. We don't have time to get into them. I'll just mention them for future reference. And that is two things in particular: how to conceptualize Zionism, how to conceptualize the role of the Jewish community and Jewish activists, progressive activists within it. Was Zionism a colonial force? Initially, the position was that it was, but not so much because of its own activities, but due to its alliance with British imperialism. In the course of time, as a result of changing Soviet priorities, and as a result of the growth of the Jewish community in Palestine itself in the 1930s and 40s, due to immigration from Europe, from Germany in the 1930s, from other countries in the 1940s, there was a growing recognition that this was not just a society of settlers, of immigrants, but a new national community. And with the recognition by the Soviet Union of the Jewish community in Palestine as a national minority, but as a whole national community, came also a transformation of the analysis from regarding it as a colonial implant to treating it as a national community with the right to national self-determination. Initially, the position was that Palestine should be a binational society where Jews and Arabs have equal rights, similar to the binationalists, but framed within a left-wing discourse. But eventually, the Soviet Union moved to supporting partition of the country between the Jewish and the Arab Palestinian national communities, because the situation seemed to be impossible to reconcile within the framework of one unitary state, even if it's regarded as a binational state rather than just a single unitary state. This position, this shift in Soviet position, created tensions within the communist forces in the country. And throughout the period, we see constant clashes, conflict, and splits between predominantly Jewish and predominantly Arab factions. And this is one of the legacies of that period. I'm going to finish on this note, that is perplexing and leaves us with questions that must be answered. In 1929, there was a sharp conflict based on the notion of Arabization, which led to the departure of the majority of Jewish activists of the party. In 1930s, there was a creation of a dissident faction known as the Jewish section of the party that moved towards more mainstream Zionist position, even though they didn't define themselves as Zionists. In 1943, there was a formal split in the party and the creation of a new left-wing Arab nationalist movement called the League of National Liberation, or National Liberation League, led by many people who later became leaders of the Israeli Communist Party, and the names may be familiar: Tawfik Tubi, Emil Habibi, Emil Toma. All these people who became leaders of the Communist Party, the Israeli Communist Party in the 1950s, started their career in the 1940s as Arab nationalist, left-wing activists within this National Liberation League. So throughout the period, despite the support for binationalism and unitary state and class struggle that supersedes the nationalist conflict, the party itself did not manage to maintain a unified structure. What does this tell us about the possibility of challenging nationalist discourse? What does this tell us about the possibility of organizing across national boundaries using universal principles such as class solidarity, class struggle, fighting for social and economic rights, and so on? These issues were not resolved during the historical period that I've been speaking about in the 1930s, but there remain challenges that we need to confront if we want to construct a different and more viable alternative to the dominant and destructive discourses of Zionism, Arab nationalism, and so on. So let me finish on this point. I am happy to make available the more historical and detailed chapters out of which this presentation was constructed. But now maybe we should move to discussion and questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Ron, for this enlightening talk. I will start with one question here. Do you think that we Jewish Israelis are the partners we expect the Palestinians to be? Can you please add a bit about the Jewish Israeli peace movements as part of mechanisms of maintenance of status quo? And what does that mean today for Israeli left and the current demonstrations on the Israeli streets? I imagine you can read it as well if I was not clear.
Yeah, this is, there are a lot of questions here. What I want to say, like by way of a short answer, is that the opportunities, the possibilities, the context for political activism changes over time. So what I was speaking about was a historical period in which Jews were a minority in the country, a growing minority, but still a minority, that was aspiring to acquire political power, either over the country as a whole or part of it. We are operating now under different conditions. And I think there is both improvement and different and more negative circumstances in which we operate today. The improvement is that we do have a political framework in the shape of the State of Israel that includes a large group of Palestinian citizens. They are a minority among the overall Palestinian population, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, but they are a substantial group. They are about 20% of the Israeli population. They are about 20% of the overall Palestinian population. And I think this group can act as a bridge between progressive Israeli forces and Palestinian forces in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the diaspora, that are fighting different manifestations of Zionism or Israeli policies. And I would say that any political strategy that tries to overcome nationalist divisions and to create a space for Israeli Jews as progressive participants in the struggle, part of the solution, not just part of the problem, has to start with an alliance within the boundaries of the state between different groups of citizens that are, of course, of different ethnic or nationalist, national background, but they also share a lot in common and can communicate and operate together. So from the way I see it, the rise of movements such as the Joint List is possibly the most positive and most hopeful development of the last few years, and potentially it can play a leading role in creating relationship, alliances, and joint activities between Israeli Jews and Palestinians inside Israel and in other segments of the Palestinian population.
Thank you. I will ask a question of my own. It goes back to the history that you presented, and I already know while I'm forming it in my head that it's probably impossible to answer, but still I will ask. Is there a particular point in this history that you recognize as sort of a missed opportunity, a point where things could have gone different?
Well, it's very difficult to answer that because we have no control. I mean, it's not just that we don't have control over history. The people who were operating at the time did not have control of it either. So what I want to say, it actually was part of the lecture, I just didn't get to it, is that the historical context within which the struggle for Palestine was conducted in the first half of the 20th century were particularly difficult for any kind of cooperative, cross-national or transnational type of political activism. We have to keep in mind that it was a period of the rise of fascism in Europe, Nazism in Germany. We experienced 2 world wars during that first half of the century, revolution, ethnic cleansing in the aftermath of war. So it wasn't really a period conducive for any kind of more cooperative relationship. I think within that context, we have to recognize there were a period in which there was some movement towards sort of more normal relationships. Most of the 1920s were actually quite relatively peaceful politically. But I think the one thing that undermined irrevocably any chance of reconciliation or compromise between the two communities, the growing immigrant-based Jewish community and the indigenous Palestinian community, was the insistence of the Zionist movement of creating an exclusionary zone from which all native Arabs were excluded as a result of land settlement, and which served the foundation of an expanding zone of exclusion that didn't allow any kind of joint operations. Why did they insist on that? That's something I mentioned with regard to Rupin's statement that just took it for granted that any land bought by Jewish agency must evict the indigenous tenants and owners and peasants and so on. Why did they insist on that? I mean, there are historical reasons for that, but I think that's a missed opportunity. They could have adopted a different pattern of settlement that was more accommodating of the indigenous people. They didn't have to exclude them totally, but they did. There was another period, that's something that some old communist activists write about in the 1940s. During the World War, paradoxically, that a local labor movement managed to bring Jewish and Arab workers together in some kind of joint struggle against government on labor issues, working conditions, salaries, and so on, because it may sound strange, but the 1940s, the first half of the 1940s, were a period of growing economic activity, quite fervent industrial growth, because Palestine was a base for a lot of British companies and British enterprises related to the war effort, and that led to the rise of a growing working class, both Jews and Arabs. There were movements in that direction, but again, the move towards creating a Jewish state, the counter move towards creating a Palestinian Arab state undermined that political possibility. I don't know if it would ever have come to anything beyond occasional joint strike, but potentially that was one possibility or one period in which there were some moves in a more collaborative cross or transnational direction, but it didn't mature into anything substantial eventually.
Which role do you think we Jewish Israeli diaspora today have in all of this? And do you have examples we may be able to learn from?
Well, I think I don't have like a sort of any kind of magic formula to follow. I think I would focus on the question of education and trying to counter Israeli propaganda or Hasbara efforts. And I think Israelis in the diaspora, Jews in different countries, are more effective in countering Zionist Israeli propaganda than anyone else. I think in general, there is a role for international pressure on Israel by states, by civil society organization. I'm not going to specify what kind of pressure, that's up to activists in different countries. And progressive Jewish activists and progressive Israeli activists in the diaspora, I don't want to call it exile, can play an important role in that. But of course, not as a different constituency, together with other progressive activists, Palestinians and locals in whichever country they happen to be.
Thank you. One more question. Not the last one, just one more. How do you think the current discussions regarding the annexation of the West Bank and the demographic shifts it would bring will affect the situation? Will they push the binational vision further into the distance, or maybe even make it look achievable in the long term?
No, I think I think annexation is not going to happen. Formal annexation is not going to happen anytime soon. But even if it were to happen, it would just formalize a situation in which there is a large degree of separation between rights-bearing Israeli citizens and rightless Palestinian subjects. So there is no intention on the part of the Israeli government, no matter whether they are next to territories or not, to incorporate Palestinians as equal citizens or residents even with any minimum degree of civil and political rights. So what it would do is basically entrench and formalize the existing situation of segregation and apartheid that already exists. So I don't see it as any move towards a more progressive solution. It just would formalize the existing oppressive conditions. The only sort of potentially positive development that might emerge out of formal annexation is that it would make it more difficult for Israel to claim that the occupation is temporary, that there is a process of negotiation that is ongoing, that there is no apartheid situation, it's just a temporary condition that will be resolved eventually, because this will basically formalize an apartheid state, and therefore it may give rise to greater opposition, criticism, and so on. But I don't see that as a positive development. It's just something, in the event it does happen, that could be taken advantage of, but it's not something that should be advocated as such.
Thank you. I have another question. You mentioned in your talk the existence of Jewish people who might have, or maybe, might have resisted, or maybe didn't feel so affiliated with the Zionist idea, but since they were already in Palestine, they felt they had a debt of some kind, or like that their presence there was in debt to the Zionist movement. And I was wondering if, how do you see it today in the Israeli society? Do you see that, is there, to your understanding, a similar sense of debt or impossibility to negate this idea because of their presence in the country, in the state?
Well, I think, it is a different situation, because we have to recognize in the 1920s, definitely in the 1930s, there were a large number of Jewish immigrants and settlers in Palestine who came there because they had no other choice. There was a massive, the most important wave of immigration that transformed the Jewish community from being about 17% of the population around 1930 to almost 30% a decade later, came from Germany. And we know, of course, that German Jews were not particularly Zionists. They came to Palestine because there was no other way for them, no other place for them to go, or it was very difficult for them to go. And of course, the Zionist movement facilitated their arrival in the country. And I don't see how they or anyone else could actually resist it, because the alternative was to stay under unbearable, extremely dangerous conditions. So people did have a sense, not every single person, of course, but in general, there was a very large number of refugees or people who were looking for asylum or had no other place to go. This is not the case today. There are some communities in Israel that were escaping or trying to move away from difficult situation, but the vast majority of Israeli Jews are there either because they were born there or because they moved there at a young age. They do have other options. The world is not entirely open for everyone, of course, but there isn't that sense of duress, of compulsion, of danger elsewhere. So I think conditions have changed, and we have no expectations that immigrant communities in Israel would have any specific relationship which is different from that of the more quote unquote indigenous Jewish communities, people who were born there or have been there for decades.
Okay, last question. Can you say something about Zionists who are not Jewish?
Well, that's a difficult issue. We know that in the United States in particular, there is a very large group of people who are Christian evangelical, who are very trenchant supporters, not just of Israel in general, but of specific hardcore racist policies to be undertaken by Israel. And they form a large part of President Donald Trump's support base. And on a number of occasions, Trump expressed amazement or consternation that these Christian evangelical care more, in his words, about Israel and are more supportive of Netanyahu than the US Jewish community, which I think is true. So it's very important not to conflate the base of support for Israel overseas, primarily among evangelical, right-wing Christians. There's a lot of support among right-wing forces in Germany and other European countries to Israel who are not Jewish. In fact, they may hate local Jews, but that doesn't at all interfere in their support for Israel. In my own country, which is South Africa, you have a massive group of Black Christian evangelicals who support the state of Israel. They don't care about this Israel as an apartheid state notion, because for them, Jews are holy people. They are Christian. They regard themselves as Zionists. In fact, the largest indigenous church in South Africa, Black indigenous church, is called the Zion Christian Church. It doesn't mean they are Zionists in the political sense that we attribute to the term today in Israel and globally, but they have a very positive attitude generally towards Israel. I don't think you need to fight them on a religious basis. You just need to separate, to try to distance their religious principles and sentiments from a political support to the Israeli state, and to try as far as it's possible to explain, but that's not easy, the state of Israel today is a political entity that has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. It does not represent Judaism historically or as a religion or as a set of values. It's a political entity that must be judged by the same tools and the same principles and the same standards that we use in order to judge all other oppressive or all other states in general. There's nothing specifically Jewish about oppressing people, but that's kind of difficult task, because you can't really argue with religion. You can try to separate it from politics, but it's not something that you should go to willingly. You may not have any choice, though.
Thank you. Okay, we are nearing the end of our session. We did start a few minutes late, so I will, with your permission, allow for one more question.
Sure.
Is that okay? Yes.
Sure.
Can you elaborate on Zionism as part of imperialism? I mean, is it part of British imperialism or unique semi-independent racist settler colonialism, and today part of US imperialism? Or maybe we shall call it Anglo-American imperialism and connect it with the British one. Then,
okay, that's an interesting question from a theoretical and political perspective. I wish I had more time to talk about it, because that was a major area of discussion in the communist movement, not just the Palestinian Communist Party, but the global communist movement. They regarded Zionism as an ally of British imperialism. They didn't say it was the same thing. They said there were two movements that came together, and therefore both of them played a negative role. But they did make a distinction between them. Now, historically, I think we have to recognize the Zionist movement did collaborate with British imperialism. British imperialism did facilitate the Zionist project through the Balfour Declaration, through facilitating immigration and land settlement and so on, in the course of the British Mandate from 1920 to 1948. But the Zionist movement was an independent force. They took advantage of whatever opportunities they had. So the alliance with the British was one such opportunity. The alliance with the French in the 1950s based on common opposition to Arab nationalism, because the French were fighting Arab nationalism in Algeria, was also an opportunity to form this kind of partnership. And from the 1960s onward, the alliance with the US, of course, is the foundation for much of Israeli policy. But these are opportunities. It's not an inherent link that is essential. And Israelis do try, the Israeli leadership does try to form good relationship, and they do have good relationship with Russia, with China, with India, with other countries. So I think they would take advantage of whatever opportunities for collaboration, for support, for alliance that present themselves. They don't have any specific commitment to US imperialism. Within this context, we also have to understand that even though they came of colonial background, the question is to what extent, and I know that you have a lecture towards the end of the month, I think, by Raif Zurek, who wrote this article about the transformation of settlers into natives, as a question, of course. And that's something that I think we need to think about in a more sort of optimistic and hopeful sense. One of the problems with colonial type analysis, the way it's applied sort of crudely, is that the assumption that indigenous people are indigenous forever, and they are always progressive force for the good, and settlers are settlers forever, and they are always negative force for the worst. But after generations, settlers may become natives. Not in the same way as indigenous people, but they become native to the country. That shapes their political consciousness. That creates new opportunities. So instead of just castigating and scolding settlers for being settlers, let's look at the opportunities for making the settlers more indigenized, more integrated into their environment. And that requires, of course, political work. It's not an easy task. Instead of consolidating them as external aliens who will always be in conflict with their native environment. Of course, it's not a task that any one of us can accomplish easily. It would require massive transformation in Israeli Jewish consciousness and political organization. But that's the task that we need to undertake, because one thing is for sure, Israeli Jews will remain part of the problem for any foreseeable future, and therefore they must become part of the solution. There is no solution that will be led by Israeli Jews, but there is also no solution that can bypass Israeli Jews, or at least some of them. So we need to develop strategies of incorporating them into a joint struggle for human rights, for social justice, for redress. I'm not saying it's easy, obviously it's not. And the political movements that I have been speaking about tried that and they failed. But there's no other way. I mean, you cannot reach a solution on the backs or behind the backs of the majority population of Israel. It's simply physically impossible. And therefore we must try to fracture, to fragment, to find openings, cracks within which we can do educational work and try to shape political consciousness. But this is a task for, the long run.